and set up what the Minister referred to as a world-class water industry structure. Whenever I've been involved in such reforms, I've always been conscious of trying to do the best thing for my state or indeed for the country, rather than what's good for my organisation. Many of you, I suspect, will be faced with the same dilemma over the coming months and years. I'm going to run you through a couple of models. The Melbourne model, which is typical of many of the models in Australia. I'm also going to run you through the Tasmanian model. I'm going to give you some of my personal views on what I think has worked and draw some common threads as well. I think the key message I want to get across today to the audience is that there are many models in Australia, each one having been designed to meet the regional challenges, their own specific regional challenges. So there is no perfect model, and one is not necessarily better than the other. But there are some common themes, and I will bring those to your attention. Okay. So let's just flick through quickly the Melbourne model. The Melbourne model is, has been in place since 1995. Originally, it was a fully integrated, vertically integrated water entity. In the mid-90s, the state government of Victoria was busy selling energy utilities, privatising them. And their intention was that they would privatise water as well. So they set up the Melbourne structure with 3 retailers and a wholesaler with the intention of selling the retailers. Under that model, the state government initially was the shareholder, but of course the intention was that would transfer to the private sector. As it happened, the government did very well out of the sale of energy, and the rationale or the need to sell water to help balance their finances no longer existed. And also the community were not nearly as supportive of the privatisation of water as they were of energy. So the structure you see there on the right-hand side is a structure that exists today. Okay, this is giving you a diagrammatic of how the structure looks. So on the left-hand side, you've got Melbourne Water here, who owns the dams, treats the water, transfers it to Melbourne, where you have 3 retailers, City West Water, South East Water, and Yarra Valley Water. They distribute the water to the customers, they collect the sewage, and then they pay Melbourne Water again for the treatment of that sewage. One of the features of this model is that the retailers own the water in the dams. And that's a very important principle, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. Okay. The interesting thing here too, the stormwater is also handled by Melbourne Water for catchments greater than 60 hectares. Below that, local government still runs stormwater. This is in Sydney, there is a catchment management authority, and the same in southeast Queensland, where they have a wholesale water supplier. But their structures are distinguished by the fact that the retailers also run their own sewage treatment. This next slide, I don't want to go through into the detail on this slide, except to say that the governance arrangements around the utilities are comprehensive. There's a number of acts and a whole swag of regulations as well that go to govern the industry. We often talk in Australia about light-handed regulation as a concept, but the reality is very different. And I think most utilities would feel that they are over-regulated. Now, the Tasmanian model, this is probably more relevant to what I understand is happening in New Zealand. So in 2005, Infrastructure Australia produced their annual report, and they determined that the water and sewage infrastructure in Tasmania was the worst in the country and was unsustainable. So likely to get much worse. At that time, 29 councils were running the water and sewage infrastructure, supported by 3 wholesalers, Hobart Water, Ersk Water and Cradle Coast Water. So having the Infrastructure Australia report in hand, the Tasmanian government moved quickly to create a new Water and Sewerage Act. And out of that act, they aggregated these 32 entities here into 4 entities: Cradle Mountain Water, Ben Lomond Water, Southern Water, each retailers. And then they were jointly serviced by a service provider called OnStream. And the intention of OnStream was to do the joint purchasing. For instance, OnStream would buy one billing system on behalf of the 3 utilities. However, by about 2013, it was clear that there were some shortfalls in this model, and the government moved again to aggregate all of those 4 utilities into one utility, which is now TasWater. And TasWater is still in place today. So just quickly, not going into any detail on this again, but just to give you a sense of the sort of regulatory structure that sits around TasWater. I really like the TasWater shareholder model. Each of the councils is a shareholder. They have a percentage ownership of the business, and that works very well, much better than the single shareholder model that is very much more common on the mainland in Australia. So whilst TasWater has a very good shareholder model, it's a bit deficient in water policy, with water policy in Tasmania probably 20 to 30 years behind what it is in Victoria and other parts of Australia. I don't want to go through this in any detail. I want to spend a bit more time on the last couple of slides, but suffice to say, when TasWater was first formed, the shareholders, the 29 councils, were guaranteed a certain level of dividend from their ownership of the business. That guarantee was independent of profits, which in retrospect was probably not a sustainable concept. And since that time, the dividends that's paid to councils are now actually a percentage of the profits, okay? Okay, some common features of nearly all of the Australian models. Just about every utility in the country is corporatised. So it operates under corporations law, identical to the law that exists for any private company in Australia. They just about every one of them has a skills-based board appointed by the shareholders. And that seems to work very well. The competition for those board positions is, in Victoria at least, very strong. So you do tend to get very good board members. All of the utilities, the vast majority of utilities pay dividends to their shareholders. The state governments generally own the utilities. So the politics of state governments can still have quite a strong influence on the operations of the utility. Every jurisdiction, every state has now an independent price-setting authority, which is often called an economic regulator, who sets the prices based on future investment programs and affordability. Each state has an active drinking water regulator, an environmental protection authority, that looks after water extracted from rivers and sewage discharges and dam safety. And I would have to say over the last 30 years, there's been dramatic improvements in Australia. I think the levels of service that are currently delivered, if you go back 30 years, if you're working 30 years ago, the sort of levels of service that are being delivered today would have been undreamt of previously. So the reforms have worked to a very large degree. The scale of change that's occurred in Australia over the last 30 years has certainly been dramatic in some cases, relentless in others. And I think another message for the audience today is this all takes time. And it does take lots of discussion, lots of collaboration, lots of give and take to get to where you need to get to. So some personal views. I think the government needs to be very clear on its strategic intent with any reforms, and this should be reflected in what I would refer to as a utility license, a license to operate. That strategic intent should drive both a very active water industry policy agenda, coming from, in your case, I guess, the national government, but also helps to set the operational priorities of the soon-to-be formed utilities. The corporatised model, I believe, is a great discipline, a great commercial discipline for the utility and for the shareholders. The corporatised model ensures that the utility takes a commercial approach, particularly around ensuring that they've got a sustainable pricing trajectory. That they've got a balance sheet and a level of debt which is sustainable, that they are properly accounting for their assets, including full depreciation and accounting for renewals. All of these things are critical, and if you don't have that commercial overlay, then you can't do anything. If you're not commercially viable, you cannot deliver the levels of service that your shareholders and your customers expect. Shareholders should receive dividends based on a percentage of the profits. I don't think the original TasWater model was ideal with a guaranteed level of dividends, but certainly in Melbourne, the dividends are tied to a percentage of the profits. And I think that's another good discipline as well. Shareholders, yes, they receive dividends, but with that dividend and their position as shareholders comes some serious onus as well. The shareholders need to take the time to fully understand the governance model that the utilities operate under. If they're operating under corporations law, then the shareholders need to understand that, and they need to understand very much the price setting process, which is established by the economic regulators. These, in Tasmania in particular, have been practices which the councils have had no experience in. And I think it's fair to say that some of the councils have struggled at times to understand how the prices are set and to understand the governance arrangements and what their levels of control can be under corporations law. But all that needs to be transparent, and the shareholders do need to commit time to understand it. Based on my experience both in Melbourne and in Tasmania, I would strongly recommend that each new entity has more than one shareholder. I think in Tasmania, I do like the model down there where we have 29 shareholders. It requires the shareholders to, come to some consensus. They do receive every year a draft business plan which they approve, and then they actively monitor our progress against that rolling 3-year business plan. That's a great discipline on us. But because there's a number of the shareholders, it does mean they need to act in unison and negotiate, their preferences and their priorities. And I think that's a good discipline for them. And generally, we get the right answer, or they get the right answer. Utility boards, I think it's very important that they're skills-based, not representative. They are running a business, a commercial business, and there's specific scientific challenges, there are health challenges, there are environmental challenges, there are economic challenges. So it's important that you have the skills on the board that can deal with those challenges effectively. To some extent, the shareholders can be representative, of course. So they bring that representative view to the table. Independent price setting. When that first started out in the mid-90s in Melbourne, I guess we were all very apprehensive about it and felt it was all a bit unnecessary. But now I think it's a fantastic discipline and a great process. It makes sure that everything is transparent and and the utilities are accountable. It means that, for instance, the utilities have to go out and consult with customers. get an agreement over the levels of service that need to be achieved and a price that's adequate to deliver that level of service. Now, all of that information is in the public domain through the price setting regulator's website. It's great for the customers to have that independent oversight of the utility, and it's great for the utility to have a clear plan. I also strongly support comparative competition and the National League table. When I was managing director at Yarra Valley Water, there wasn't a day go by that I didn't think about what Kevin Young was doing at Sydney Water or what my neighbours were doing at South East Water or City West Water. And nobody wants to be bottom of the league table, and it is a major spur for innovation in the absence of real competition. It's very important to have well-resourced regulators with teeth. That's essential. The regulators also need to stand up and justify their standards, because they will be major drivers of price increases over the future term, and they need to be able to stand up in public and justify their position. Utilities need to have sufficient scale. This was the problem with the initial model in Tasmania. The 4 utilities that were created in 2009 simply didn't have the scale or the balance sheet to deliver all the services they had to deliver, to support the growth, to subsidise the remote communities and attract good staff. They just weren't big enough. They couldn't offer the salaries to get the right staff. So scale is very important. Another very important factor, I think, is the utility should own the water in the dams. In Victoria, we call that bulk water entitlements. Those entitlements are tradable, so the utilities can sell them to other parties if they don't need them in a wet year, or they can buy more water in a dry year. But the important thing is that the entitlement to the water is crystal clear. Otherwise, you're going to run into major problems when you have a drought or you have some other incident that creates a shortage of water. I think it's also very important that utilities have some control over land use and water supply catchments. In Tasmania, we don't have enough control over the land use and water supply catchments. So the water quality coming off catchments, particularly those that are intensively farmed, is not good, which means that we have to spend a lot of money on treating the water to make it safe, whereas a few preventative measures at the top end of the catchment could be a better answer for the whole community. If you do decide to go down the route of separating wholesale and retail, like many of the models in Australia, then ideally each retailer should be serviced by more than one wholesaler, in my view, because the wholesaler is a major cost driver in the utility, and it's important to keep the wholesalers on their toes as well. And if you've got more than one, then you can have some comparative competition to keep them both on their toes. And the other advice I would give you is that you really do need to invest in communications. No one else is going to tell your story of reform. I think in Tasmania, we were too late to tell that story. Our customers didn't understand why. It took us a long time to get them on board and to get the levels of customer satisfaction up. So that's the end of the story. The last message I will leave you is reform is a journey, not just an event. But if at all possible, I would encourage you to start with the final destination in mind. Thank you very much.